Well, should we ask each other questions?
Yeah, we don't really know what the format is. We were discussing
Yeah.
ourselves how little we understood about the format of this. But yeah, I have a question. I read. It was one of the things I loved about Lawrence's new book, your new book, is that the villain, in a sense, the person who dies, is the criminal, and you have the cop, and it's not set up as the straightforward cop going after the bad guy. So they have a weird kind of friendship when they meet again, these two characters. And I like that you use the crime story to put together two people who are normally the sort of opposites, and they have this weird sort of relationship. That was really interesting to me, that bring together people who have taken two very different paths in life, and rather than just having them as opposites, bring them back together, and there's a weird kind, there's not a sort of anger, there's a kind of connection there. And that I found that quite touching, and that's sort of the heart of the book.
Thank you. I remember years ago, a friend of mine was telling me that he sort of stayed in touch because he stayed in the same city that he'd gone to high school with, and he said there was one element of the kids in his high school that they were ones who were a little rough, they got into trouble a little, and all of them either became crooks or cops. That was what both groups went there, and someone could probably figure out what was the determinant that set some in one direction and some in the other. I think a fair amount of the time it may simply have been chance.
Yeah, I remember hearing in the news actually that there was, when they're looking at this is in the UK, recruiting for the army, that you go to often these estates that they recruit from, because people are often very poor, and they, you meet these soldiers, and they said, listen, the choice was I become a criminal or I become a member of the military, and again, it's the same thing. The same thing.
Mm-hmm. You must have had to do a great amount of research in order to write your book. I mean, mine, I read books set in New York, so every once in a while I walk around and look at the neighborhood, and there's not too much more to it than that, but you have a lot going on.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I've always loved about books is their ability to take you to other worlds, and so the research for me was about, was a pleasure. It wasn't a chore. It wasn't I didn't find it laborious. In fact, in many ways, I don't know if I would have finished Child 44, which was written without any deal in place. I didn't have a publisher. I didn't have a book agent. And I went to a bookstore, and I remember thinking, I'm going to buy these books rather than borrow them from a library, because if I spend all this money on these books, then it's going to make me finish them. They're going to sit behind me, and they're going to sort of demand that I finish this book. And whenever I got, a little bit nervous or a little bit dry, I'd wake up one morning and I'd pick up a book and I'd read it, and I'd find some story that would inspire me. And so the research was actually hugely enjoyable and very inspirational. So, it wasn't difficult in that sense.
Did you travel a lot also?
Yeah, I did a lot. I mean, the traveling is interesting because I remember particularly for Budapest, the second book, Secret Speech, is set in Budapest for the Hungarian Revolution, and I took so many notes when I was there. I took like physical design of buildings, and all of them were cut. I mean, it's strange. I think that kind of physicality, you become obsessed with it when you're traveling. You think it's very important, but it's not as important a story as you think it is. Because, if you think about writing a thriller if I was to write a thriller in London, which I know very well, I wouldn't describe Buckingham Palace or Big Ben, because it just seems ridiculous. And it's the same thing if you're going to write in a city that you don't know very well. You need to treat it with a confidence as though you live there. And that confidence you have to fake. And in order to fake it, you don't push a load of research on the reader, I think. Because that, in a way, gives away that you're nervous about the fact that you haven't lived there. You have to feign the confidence. And that means pulling back on some of the research.
There are books that smell of the lamp, as they say. And there are ones where you'll see I won't cite any of the writers, because in some instances they're writers I very much admire, but in the course of their research, they learned something. And they're damned if they're going to let it go to waste. So it's going to be in that book whether it has any reason to or not. And you see that once in a while. I think there's an advantage, though, in going there and seeing things and then throwing your notes away and forgetting it and
that's definitely. I think the reader likes the idea that there's stuff that you haven't put into the book, like as if they met you and asked you questions, you could answer it. It's like you have to give the impression that you know things, even if it isn't there. It's like you need to give the margins need to feel full. You can't see it, but you need to feel like, were you to interview the writer, they could describe a building that isn't described. So there's that weird trick that you're playing, I think, and that's the stuff. Like you feel like the reader wants to feel like there's stuff that you have thrown away and that you could pull back in and show. It's almost, and that I think is the trick there.
That reminds me of one of the favorite questions that I ever got at an event like this. A lot of the books that I write are books in one series or another, so there are ongoing characters in that. And someone asked one time, "What do your characters do between books?" And I just love that.
Yeah, I think you want to feel like they have a life outside.
Absolutely.
In fact, that's one of the big problems I have with science fiction sometimes. Is you look at the extras, and I want to know what their story is. It's a real advantage, particularly in movies. If you have a movie set in a contemporary world, and you see people walking down Fifth Avenue, you understand what they're doing. They're going shopping or they're going to work. Often in science fiction, I see people moving, and I'm like, I want to know what that story is. Even if that isn't the story, I want to feel like there are millions of other story possibilities you could move into. And when you don't feel that, when you feel they're just sort of moving around without a story, the world suddenly feels very empty. I feel like it's very important that the stuff you don't see feels like you could explore.
Mm-hmm. I had a conversation one time, I remember, with a fellow named Bill Reel. He died a year or two ago. For years he wrote a newspaper column in first the Daily News and then I guess Newsday. And he was trying to get what fiction writers do, I think. And we were having lunch in a place in Soho. And he said, I suppose if you were going to set a scene in a place like this, you would come down and you would take notes and everything. And I realized that was the difference between what a journalist does and what I as a fiction writer would do. And I said, well, you could do that if you were writing, a piece that had to be specifically about this. But I said, I'd just make it all up. I just decide what I wanted the restaurant to be, and that's what it would be. And that was a leap for him to look at it that way.
I remember my dad almost said exactly the same thing when I was, 13 or 14. He said, the best thing for you to do if you wanted to become a writer would be to go to a park, sit on a park bench, and just write down everything you heard. And so this was going to produce the great novel. And I think it's because he, first of all, liked a certain kind of, realism, I think. And he thought that somehow I would soak up all these fragments of great stories and turn it into a novel, when in fact all you'd hear would be maybe 5 seconds of a couple arguing, someone walking a dog. I mean, it would be the most boring book that's ever been created, I think. But that was very much his sense of what a writer should be, this very literal sponge.
Yeah.
And I think if you did that, the technique of sitting in a coffee shop, you would probably, I don't know there are some writers that do write in coffee shops, but I'm pretty sure they don't get their next book from that coffee shop.
Yeah.